That's exactly what I did, creating an itemized list of only the things I couldn't live without by auditing every material object that I owned. And, in the process, I was incredibly surprised by both the amount of stuff that I'd accumulated over the years and the relatively small amount of stuff that I really needed. Once the list was complete, I would run through the same meticulous routine every morning, placing the most cherished of my personal belongings into a combination of my pockets and a backpack that I had bought for this very purpose. But one day, I left my house for work in the morning and forgot the backpack, and when I got home that night, it too was gone. After this had gone on for about 2 months, so many household items had disappeared that my wife had assumed that I had been decluttering the home, purging it of my unwanted things. This was of course not the case, but I was too afraid to tell her the truth, too afraid that she'd think it was all preposterous, so I just played along. However, I was so disappointed with myself for lying to my wife, and at the same time, so frustrated with the disappearing items that I swore to put an end to the situation, once and for all. So I ordered a surveillance camera, and as soon as it arrived, I installed it before leaving my house for work in the morning. But when I got home that night, sure enough, the camera was gone. That's when I realized that whoever or whatever was taking my things was aware that I was aware of it and was actively thwarting my attempts to thwart it. But that only made me want to thwart it even more. The next week, I faked being sick, calling out from work each day for the sole purpose of coming up with a plan for how to stop the mysterious disappearances or find out who or what was behind them or both. That's when I had the realization that nothing seemed to disappear when my wife left the house, and only when I did. Since I'd been married to her for 8 years, and was fairly certain she wasn't the one hiding my things, I grew confident that there was someone or something else in the house who was specifically taking my things whenever I left. So, I reached out to my company's HR contact requesting to work remotely, and less than a month later the request got approved and I started working from home. Sure enough, a month went by and nothing was stolen, which led me to wonder whether it had actually been my wife's doing after all, rationalizing that even though she did tend to leave the house before me and get back after me every day, she could easily come home during her lunch break. It took me a week to gather the courage to confront her about it, and I finally accused my wife of 8 years and trusted confidant of something completely outlandish, and just as I had feared, she thought it was all preposterous, and as to be expected, she could not have been more offended. We had the worst fight of our marriage that night, and both went to bed upset. And so, the next day, I decided to sacrifice a physical possession in order to make it up to Sarah, leaving my house for work in the morning with the sole purpose of buying her flowers. But when I got home that night, gift in hand, and ready to apologize, this time, Sarah herself was gone. I should have known that she too had been taken away, but I was so obsessed with understanding the situation that I convinced myself that Sarah, still angry at me from the night before, must have up and left. And with Sarah gone, I could finally know for sure whether she was the one behind everything. Once again, I left my house for work in the morning, and when I got home that night, the flowers that I had bought for Sarah the day before were gone, and she had still not returned. But rather than accept the truth, I remembered that she still had the keys to the house. So the next day, I hired a locksmith to change every lock in the home before leaving my house for work in the morning. But when I got home that night, my coffee table was gone, and that's when I knew for certain that Sarah wasn't the one behind the strange disappearances. That's when I knew that she was actually the victim of them, and that something else was undoubtedly in the house. My wife now missing. I cried myself to sleep hard that night, clenching at the very sheets that she once slept up on beside me. The next morning, I thought about calling the police, but I knew that the tale would sound so far-fetched that they'd never believe me. My sadness quickly turned to rage, and I proceeded to tear my home apart, searching under every bed, inside every closet, behind every curtain, and around every corner for any sign of the culprit or the missing items or both, leaving no stone unturned. But ultimately, I found nothing. That's when I remembered the basement, or lack thereof. The truth is, when we first bought the home, we were told that there had once been a basement, but at some point over the years, one of its previous owners had sealed it off, leaving no trace of a stairway downstairs. If I could just find such a stairway, or secret passage to the cellar, I just might be able to find the culprit, who I imagined would be sitting there, surrounded by a heaping pile of everything that had gone missing, including my wife. But no matter where I looked, I found nothing. Defeated, depressed, and terrified, All at the same time, I strongly considered moving to an entirely new house, but ultimately, I couldn't bring myself to leave the place that I'd called home for the past 8 years of marriage. Instead, my obsession with figuring out who or what had taken my wife and to where consumed me and led me to drastic measures. And so, I started clearing out the house, selling off anything anyone would buy, and giving away anything left over, until my once cluttered home was reduced to an empty shell of its former self. When I finally got rid of the last item, I collapsed onto the rugless floor of the now barren living room and sat there in silence, exhausted from what I'd just done, but at the same time, satisfied